And eventually, it created what George Packer called a new feeling in the country, that the race riots, that the instability and crime in the cities, that the anti-Americanism, that the peacenik movement against the war, it had all sort of gone too far. Things were a bit crazy. And the candidate that best captured that sentiment, that expressed that frustration, was Richard Nixon. And what is a populist? What is populism? Well, I think the best way I've heard it described is it's sort of a conflict between the people and the powerful, right? It's tension between the wholesome, sort of landed masses and the ethereal, the abstract elites who live in the ivory tower and are sort of out of touch with reality and condescend towards the average person, towards the average American in this case. What has happened this go round with Donald Trump, the populist, and I think that's what he is. Another man that harnessed this feeling, this sentiment, this bitterness, the sense of abandonment by middle America, or as Trump called him, the forgotten America. That's propelled him into the White House yet again, except that this time, even more so than last time, it appears as though the populism in Donald Trump, just like the populism in Nixon and Reagan and all these expressions, explosions of populism before him, have either been contained or completely extinguished. What is absolutely clear to me is that MAGA as a movement is not just at an end, but populism as a sort of reactive impulse in this country, that's dead too. Welcome back to Men and the City. I hope all of you are doing well. Today I'm coming at you from rural Virginia, which I think is sort of an appropriate backdrop for the theme, the topic that we're going to talk about today. And today's video is going to be called The Fall of American Populism and the Rise of Something New. I want to take everybody back to 1960 because 1960, appropriately so in my view, is the genesis of a radical turn in this country's history. In fact, it's the starting point for Charles Murray's book, Coming Apart, which is all about the rise and fall of the white working class in the United States. And he chose 1960 for many reasons. It wasn't just a sort of interesting bookend to mark 50 years of social data and metrics, but that country in 1960, and obviously I wasn't alive then, but I know a lot of people were, that was a very different country. And even though there was some pushback against JFK because he was a Catholic, and that was still a thing in those days, even though there was corruption around him, even though he was a flawed person, to be sure, and we were in the midst of the Cold War, there was still a pervasive sense, I think, in the United States of optimism, of exuberance, the sense that we could go to the moon, we could do all kinds of things.
But why, some say, the moon? Why choose this as our goal? And they may well ask, why climb the highest mountain? Why, 35 years ago, fly the Atlantic? Why does Rice play Texas? We choose to go to the moon. We choose to go to the moon. We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard.
That sentiment, of course, today is almost completely gone. People today are so negative. I think you see that manifest in Hollywood film, in Netflix productions, in literature. It's sort of a dark overtone. But that was not the case in 1960 when JFK was elected. Of course, shortly thereafter, things started to go awry, didn't they? When he was assassinated in 1963, I think unconsciously as well as consciously, but more so unconsciously, that was sort of an earthquake in this country's psychology. It was shocking, to be sure, that a president, one as optimistic, with soaring rhetoric, a man who was good-looking, interacted well on television, so forth and so on, it sort of exuded a lot of the virtues of America, was killed so publicly so grotesquely. And then, of course, as we know, things got ever worse from there, did they not? We then plunged into Vietnam, a war I think that JFK was trying to avoid. And that war shook the foundations of trust in this country without question. At the same time, you had the civil rights movement, which was, I think, far more harrowing than people realize today. I mean, it's sort of mythologized by the left as this crusade for moral betterment in the United States. Maybe there was some element of that, but look, there were race riots, you had fire bombings, you had a lot of hippie sort of radicalism. The anti-draft movement was very strong.
Tuesday's disorders started when the students, as if on prearranged signal, poured from the schools in the city's ghettoed east side. It was, they said, a protest against the system's failure to close the schools for Dr. King's funeral. It soon became an excuse for lawlessness. School principal James Boyd surrendered his school for fear of violence.
Outside, there were a number of things happening that were certainly threatening as far as we were concerned. Many people we did not know outside the building.
Less than an hour later, the school board closed them all. WHB listeners got the word first.
From the Board of Education this afternoon, we are announcing, on the recommendation of the Superintendent of Schools, Mr. James A. Hazlitt, that school be dismissed.
Another hour later, as groups and gangs milled about, the National Guard was summoned.
Here in the state capitol, Governor Warren Hern says he's ordering elements of the National Guard to Kansas City.
And as I said, there just seemed to have been a permutation psychologically in this country, and that generated a sense of unease, of distemperament in what Jerry Falwell called the moral majority. And eventually, it created what George Packer called a new feeling in the country, that the race riots, that the instability and crime in the cities, that the anti-Americanism, that sort of the peacenik movement against the war, it had all sort of gone too far. Things were a bit crazy. And the candidate that best captured that sentiment, that expressed that frustration, was Richard Nixon.
Well, when style and charisma connotes the idea of contriving of public relations, I don't buy it at all. As I look back on the history of this country, some of our great leaders would not have been perhaps great television personalities, but they were great presidents because of what they stood for, because of their principle, their courage, their character. Now, I hope to win this election. If I do win this election, I think I will conduct the presidency in a way that I will command the respect of the American people. That may not be the same style of some of my predecessors, but it will enable me to lead.
Richard Nixon was very definitely a populist. And what is a populist? What is populism? Well, I think the best way I've heard it described is a conflict between the people and the powerful. It's tension between the wholesome, sort of landed masses and the ethereal, the abstract elites who live in the ivory tower and are sort of out of touch with reality and condescend towards the average person, towards the average American in this case. And I think there was a lot of substance to that sentiment, to be sure. And as we know, that was sort of just the beginning of a cultural revolution imposed from above. That generated this populist figure in Richard Nixon and a new kind of politics. But as we know, Nixon, he did open up China. He did establish détente with the Soviets. Nixon also illegally bombed Laos and Cambodia. Nixon also affirmed a lot of the Cultural Revolution that he, at least aspirationally, was opposing. He expanded affirmative action, for example, and he sort of let the Great Society programs fester. And of course, let's not forget that he suspended the gold standard, which has done irreparable damage to the American dollar and our currency. So while the sentiment was strong for him, he governed very differently than he campaigned. And that's a big part of this story. Fast forward to Reagan in the 80s, you get a similar kind of dynamic. You had inflation, you had recession, you had economic turmoil, the sense from Carter that the United States was not as strong as it once was, certainly on the heels of Vietnam. There was a sense that we'd lost that war, that we weren't this strong, exuberant country, that we were when JFK became president in 1960, and I don't think we were. And Carter failed to sort of mend those wounds. And so you get this man named Ronald Reagan, who, again, sort of exhibited a lot of the Nixonian virtues in the sense that he was a populist. He was trying to restore that sense of patriotism in the country, and for a lot of boomers, that's what he did. He was sort of the boomer savior, as I've called him.
Whatever else history may say about my candidacy, I hope it will be recorded that I appeal to our best hopes, not our worst fears, to our confidence rather than our doubts, to the facts, not to fantasies. And these three, hope, confidence, and facts, are at the heart of my vision of peace.
And Reagan pulled us out of a very bitter recession in 1982. He rebuilt the military, which was a total disaster. I mean, people that served in the armed forces in the 70s can tell you that there was rampant drug abuse, there was prostitution, there was corruption. It was just a broad-based degradation of the U.S. military, and Reagan did address that. Reagan also embraced a sort of limited government, more libertarian-like platform that would later become sort of the wellspring of the conservative movement after him. He also brought in the evangelical Christians into the Republican Party and restored a sense of trust in government. But, just like Nixon, was very flawed. This is a man who financialized the U.S. economy, blew up the debt with lots of deficit spending, mostly on defense. And of course, I think the ultimate betrayal was the amnesty that he signed, which has maybe been more impactful than the Immigration and Naturalization Act of, I think, 1965, in the sense that he was supposed to legalize, I think it was like 1 million illegal immigrants, and it turned out to be 3 million, and then of course we know what happened. The floodgates were open. So again, like Nixon, who ostensibly came in to end the Vietnam War, to sort of stop the Cultural Revolution from above, Reagan similarly, he fought forever wars. He blew up the deficit, financialized the economy, deregulated Wall Street. A lot of these things that people didn't understand until later how deleterious they really were. And they were. And in many ways, the structural debts that we're dealing with today go back to the failure of the Reagan Revolution, as it was called. So Reagan was another populist that sort of came in and went, made us feel good, but when you look at the details, it wasn't exactly as we've been told. And I think more and more people are beginning to realize that as they more closely examine his record. What followed that period, of course, was the rise of a couple other figures that I think qualify as populist. One of them was Patrick Buchanan. And Patrick Buchanan, who was a Nixon acolyte and defender, also recognized that there was a real problem with the Republican Party, that the Republicans and the Democrats, frankly, had increasingly become the party of the elites, and that there was a neglected America. What about the average American, the average factory worker, the average union worker? Nobody seemed to care or represent them. And of course, eventually, you ended up with NAFTA, a disastrous free trade agreement, the offshoring of America's manufacturing, all of these things that Patrick Buchanan campaigned against and strongly opposed. As did another figure in Ross Perot. Ross Perot, who famously, or rather infamously, depending on how you look at it, ran for president in 1992 and was the most successful third-party candidate in the history of the country in the 20th century since Teddy Roosevelt.
Good evening. Welcome to this third and final debate among the three major candidates for President of the United States. Governor Bill Clinton, the Democratic nominee, President George Bush, the Republican nominee, and independent candidate Ross Perot.
I think he was the only one, other than Teddy in 1912, to get on the ballot as a legitimate third-party candidate. In fact, early on in that summer, 1992, if I'm not mistaken, he was actually leading in some of the national polls. And what was his issue? Well, it wasn't just NAFTA, it was also the national debt. And he changed the national conversation about that because he was so ferocious in his commitment to that issue and calling attention to the dangers of the debt and the deficits and the spending and so forth. But again, Ross Perot, he didn't become president. Bill Clinton did. Now, Bill Clinton, to his credit, said the age of big government was over, achieved a budget surplus at least year over year. Now, he didn't eradicate the national debt. But nonetheless, Pat Buchanan, Ross Perot, and of course their predecessors, Ronald Reagan and Richard Nixon, they tried and they ginned up a lot of support, a lot of enthusiasm, but they failed. I think it's appropriate to talk about the Tea Party. I think they were sort of the next major populist surge to emerge in this country. And they did, in large measure, because of the Wall Street bailouts, reckless spending, once again, from the federal government, the sense that the will of the people had been betrayed, that there was some kind of backdoor deal done to bail out the bankers, and indeed there was.
Neither party is completely happy with the final bill. Lawmakers have heard from thousands of voters angry about taxpayers' dollars being used to bail out Wall Street. President Bush acknowledged it's a tough call for members of Congress, but he says the money will go far beyond Wall Street.
A vote for this bill is a vote to prevent economic damage.
And the emergence of a new presidential figure in Barack Obama, who white America, the boomer America, did not trust. A man who was a socialist, a man who wrote a book called Dreams from My Father, his father being a Kenyan, his mother being the American in the family, a white girl from Kansas, but he didn't write a book about her. Instead, he praised his father and seemed to harbor some real resentment towards the United States. It, in fact, helped him get elected. Over the objections, I might add, of the white demographic that voted by majority against him twice, and as I've talked about before, he won anyway. That was very definitely a moment that registers in the psyche of this country, in my view, another turning point. But nonetheless, you got the Tea Party, and the Tea Party was an attempt to correct a shamelessly, hopelessly corrupt Republican Party. Again, another sort of organic, grassroots, populist movement. One that created local chapters, that put together a platform of candidates who were true fiscal conservatives, Tea Partiers, against the so-called rhinos, the Republican in name only. And that created a shell shock in the interim elections of 2010, right after Obama had been elected in 2008. Needless to say, their efforts, though valiant, failed. They didn't change the fiscal trajectory of the country whatsoever, and in their attempt to sort of cleanse the Republican Party or purge it, they were purged. They were contained. They were overcome, and so nothing meaningfully changed. So yet again, populism failed. But that brings us to, I think, the present moment, and a spectacular, an offensive, an electrifying, an idiosyncratic, a clunky new presidential candidate emerged in 2015, accepting the baton from the Tea Party, who had accepted it from Ross Perot and Pat Buchanan, among others. And Donald Trump seemed to be different because he, unlike Ross Perot and Pat Buchanan and many of these other folks, he seemed to be a legitimate outsider. He seemed to be somebody that would tell you the unvarnished truth. However erratically he spoke it, and certainly he was erratic. Incoherent ramblings, super bravado, egoistic exaggeration about how great he was, how smart he was. But in spite of those flaws, they actually served him well, because what he did is he exposed a media industrial complex that was systemically corrupt and broken. A bunch of people that had lied about wars overseas, illegal immigration, that had a lot of skeletons in their closet, and Donald Trump was sort of like a bomb that just blew up the status quo. But then he was elected in 2016, and obviously that was a shock. It was another shock to the system, but a much bigger one, I would argue, than what had come previously. Certainly bigger than the Tea Party in 2010, bigger than Ross Perot in 92, bigger, I think, than Reagan and Nixon before him, to be sure. Because Donald Trump seemed to very definitely be at war with a deep state, as people call it, the swamp, if you will. in ways that no other populist had been before. And that led to a very tumultuous, hectic, disruptive 4-year tenure in the White House that ended almost with the same volume of bang that it began with because of the January 6th sort of populist rebellion against what people perceived to have been a stolen election. In any case, what has happened this go-round with Donald Trump, the populist, and I think that's what he is, another man that harnessed this feeling, this sentiment, this bitterness, the sense of abandonment by middle America, or as Trump called him, the forgotten America. That's propelled him into the White House yet again, except that this time, even more so than last time, it appears as though the populism in Donald Trump, just like the populism in Nixon and Reagan and all these expressions, explosions of populism before him, have either been contained or completely extinguished. Immediately upon assuming office in January, Donald Trump, who campaigned on ending the war in Ukraine, has failed to do so, and failed in a rather tragic sense. I mean, he seems to sort of vacillate day by day, minute by minute, second by second, but nonetheless, the war persists. And despite vacillating, he sort of maintains that it's Biden's war and that Putin is bad and so forth. But fundamentally speaking, nothing's changed, even though he said it would. What about immigration? Well, immigration has been a major disappointment, This was a man that promised mass deportations, a man that promised that we would get control of our borders, a man that said he would fulfill the mandate of 2016. And I see virtually no evidence that he's doing that whatsoever. And certainly I'm not the Lone Ranger. In fact, just recently, I think Trump has been talking about granting some kind of amnesty, just like Ronald Reagan in the 1980s.
Got myself into a little trouble because I said, I don't want to take people away from the farmers. People have worked for a farm on a farm for 14, 15 years, and they get thrown out pretty viciously, and we can't do it. We got to work with the farmers and people that have hotels and leisure properties too. We're going to work with them, and we're going to work very strong and smart, and we're going to put you in charge. We're going to make you responsible. And I think that that's going to make a lot of people happy. Now, serious radical right people, who I also happen to like a lot, they may not be quite as happy, but they'll understand, won't they? Do you think so?
Worse than that, you have this disastrous Dr. Strange-esque level of recklessness that occurred in the skirmish that flashed into a war between Israel and Iran that happened in June of this year. And that saw the United States strike the nuclear facilities of a country that poses absolutely no threat to the United States whatsoever, a nation that's complied with the Non-Proliferation Treaty, a nation that's permitted IAEA inspectors in, a nation that, frankly speaking, we have no business being in a war against or in any kind of kinetic activity against whatsoever. And yet we are. And why? Well, because, as has been the case with Gaza, the President of the United States, Donald Trump, seems committed to representing Israel domestically, representing Israeli interests in the Middle East, touting the virtues of one Bibi Netanyahu as sort of a great hero, even though, according to the ICC and humanitarian groups around the world, the man is a war criminal, even though there's a genocide going on in Gaza, one that's being fueled by American armament, equipment, military, political, diplomatic resources. Why? Well, because of AIPAC, and because obviously Donald Trump, who was devoted to Israel in his first term too, seems to be doubling down on that. And of course, lastly, we have this Epstein issue. It would not be as big of an issue, I suppose, if the president and his various supporters had not evangelized it as long as they did, telling the public that whatever Epstein was doing was a massive conspiracy, that they were going to get to the bottom of it and restore some trust and confidence in the system. Of course, now they're backtracking on all of that, which tells you that it is a big deal, that whatever Epstein was engaged in is lethal to the legacy government, to the intelligence agencies, to American-Israeli relations, potentially American relations with countries around the world, who knows? But backtracking on Epstein, failing to fulfill his mandate on the border, striking Iran, perpetuating forever wars, and unilaterally supporting a country that's murdering innocent civilians with our blessing, with our armaments and equipment, as I said, these are all things that represent a fundamental betrayal of the populist movement, the MAGA movement, that got started because of Trump in 2015. Now, Trump has tweeted out, as he is wont to do, defamatory things, childish sort of insults at anybody in MAGA or beyond who challenges him, and egomaniacally said that MAGA is just him and nothing else, that he created it, he can make it whatever he wants. And so if you add all these things up, it seems like this man, Donald Trump, who was very flawed, transparently flawed, has been captured completely. That his populism, that the fire in him that stirred up so much organic grassroots support from middle America, from the silent majority, from the forgotten Americans, that was a complete fraud. That MAGA as a marketing gimmick is basically over. It's been exposed as a fraud. Now, obviously, a lot of MAGAns haven't figured this out yet, and it will take some time for them to figure it out. But more importantly than Trump and MAGA, I think what this illustrates is that populism, which is a movement, some people call it movement conservatism, it's failed. It's over. And it's a reactionary politics that has been swept up in this country since the 1960s. And while there's a lot of fury and fervor, nothing meaningful seems to come. Now, does it? And that tells me that we are at an inflection point, that the masses will figure this out, and that fire within them that produced populism is now going to flame into something new, something even more aggressive, perhaps revolutionary. We'll have to see. I have talked about this as sort of metapolitical or a metapolitics. I think what we're witnessing is a kind of total disillusionment psychologically in our politics in general. The realization that democracy as constructed today is a fraud, it's a sham, it doesn't change a damn thing, and Donald Trump, whatever else he may be, is just another sort of carnival barker that's activating the animal spirits in MAGA, but is failing wholeheartedly to deliver on anything because he's part of a system that's completely irreparably broken. And so that means that we, as Tucker Carlson and other people I think that are savvy have hinted, we're headed into something quite different.
I'm worried that the contradictions are too obvious, the lies are too transparent, this is too insulting. I can't even deal with it. I feel like I'm the least radical person I know. I'm happy to not talk about certain subjects just so we can all get along. I'm a WASP in the end. I don't want conflict, okay? I know everyone thinks I hate conflict actually. But they're forcing this on all of us, and I feel like the system is breaking as a result.
Yeah.
Do you feel that?
I do.
I say this in part topically because there is now finally a talk again of a new party. This comes from Elon Musk. It comes from sort of the Silicon Valley financial power, the venture capital brain trust. And on that basis, I don't think that that's going to ultimately be the source of anything sustainable that we would call a new party or new movement. But that does not mean that the idea itself is not going to manifest. And the worse the Trump administration gets, meaning the more obvious it becomes to people that this is just business as usual, that the corruption of the Biden administration is the same in the Trump administration, that one administration's wars become the other's wars, et cetera, and there just was no meaningful change one way or the other, is leading Americans to the realization that something else has to happen, that something else must occur. And that means something like the organic, the spontaneous reorganization of Americans, real Americans, of the ethnos, as I've termed it before, into something that transcends politics. And I've talked about this at length since I started this channel in various iterations. I've talked about the cryptosphere, I've talked about the sexless men of the manosphere, I've talked about the alternative media complex, I've talked about the red pill community. All of these things are sort of agitating against the same broken system. And I think you're going to start to see that coalesce a lot more, coagulate, to fuse into something bigger. Now that is going to be a challenge because starting a new party in this country is very, very difficult for obvious reasons. One of which is that the logistics are just hard. You got to get signatures, you have to get them by certain dates in all 50 states to get on the ballot. You have to have a platform that can galvanize millions of people. You need to raise huge amounts of capital. But all of these things are just really not the big obstacles that people think if the broader population comes to the conclusion that it just doesn't matter who you vote for. And I think that's exactly the conclusion that many of them are coming to, especially as the consequences of continuity really begin to disrupt the average American's livelihood. And specifically what I mean is, as soon as people realize that we are now in a regional war on behalf of Israel, that at the behest of a foreign power, we are bankrupting ourselves to fight an enemy that in no way, shape, or form opposes us or conflicts with our interests. As soon as people really begin to understand and realize that we have a serious emergency crisis in immigration in this country, that whole communities, whole counties, whole towns, whole states are being changed demographically beyond recognition, and there's literally nothing that the president is doing about it. And maybe he lacks the capacity to do anything about it. He doesn't have the power, as I've suggested before, to declare the Insurrection Act, for example. And you've seen sort of elements of this or hints of this in the race riots and the street violence in Los Angeles, where the federal government, in stark contrast to the last time the Insurrection Act was declared in 1992 on the heels of the Rodney King riots, which swept LA up into a frenzy of anarchy. President Bush, if you go back and watch that speech, he had support from every level of government. From the mayor of Los Angeles to the governor of California to the military collectively. They were all activated to suppress that insurrection. And today, Trump doesn't have unity of government whatsoever. This despite the fact, of course, that he's been captured, whatever that means, that his populism has been contained. And of course, then there's the economy, the total failure of any fiscal reform, the rejection of Doge, the ignominious exit of Elon Musk. All of this has just buried any attempt whatsoever by the administration to reorganize the government to avert a fiscal catastrophe. And what are they doing? Well, they're reverting right back to what every administration has, more or less since the 1960s, or 1971 when Nixon suspended the gold standard, and that is, we're going to somehow grow our way out of it. Of course, people seem to fail to understand that we've been growing, at least nominally, for 50 years. That hasn't done anything to even marginally impact the debt. So we're going to have a fiscal crisis. And then, of course, the underlying economy, I think, is in very bad shape, despite what Wall Street and the mainstream and record high stock markets will tell you. A lot of Americans are hurting. They're living paycheck to paycheck. They're looking for jobs that just aren't there. Maybe they're buried in credit card debt. They can't pay their mortgage payments. I mean, you start looking at the data, and these are not just stats. They're pretty ugly, I think. And as I've made videos in the past, I think that sort of difficulty appears to be migrating up the income ladder as well. All of this seems to be converging into some kind of broader crisis, meshed with this new sentiment for a kind of more radical politics. And I think it's noteworthy that swing, in terms of archetypes, from people that are moderate, people that want to sort of incrementally change things because they recognize that we need reform, to conservatives who want, call it more aggressive corrective reform, to populists who, as I said, stir up sort of the animal spirits, but then sort of fail to deliver. And then eventually you get to radicals and radicalization as the population gets really angry, gets pissed off because their will is not being done. And then eventually you get to real reform. Well, on that continuum, if you will, I think we're about to pivot away or shift away from the populists and into a period of more radicalization. We'll see how much daylight there is between now and then. But what is absolutely clear to me is that MAGA as a movement is not just at an end, but populism as a sort of reactive impulse in this country, that's dead too. And the politics that supported it are as well. Now we're into something else, some kind of new politics, some metapolitical thing that's going to break the system completely and hopefully reset America to effect, as I've talked about before, a succession, an end to this sort of bastardized post-constitutional order and into a new framework of government, a new constitutional order. I think the energy for this is building, I really do, and I think it's just about to get mainstream once the MAGA fantasy completely dies. One thing is absolutely clear to me, though, and that is that our political system cannot fix itself. So maybe I'm wrong in my forecast in the sense that I'm a bit premature. That could be. I don't think so because of the financial mess and the wars overseas, which I see getting much worse, much faster than most. But the political system is broken and it will only get worse from here. There's no question about that. And it needs to, because that's the only way that we can deal with this. We've got to take that sort of subterranean deep dive into the ugliness if we're going to pull ourselves out of that. And that means that we've got to reject populism in favor of something different, something new, something bigger, something that almost certainly will be more radical, but that's got to be focused on systemic reform. And it's got to be activated at the grassroots, organic sort of ethnos level, because we are the country. We represent the land, the heartland of this country. Even though they're completely out of touch, my sense is that the average American is much more clued into this than you might realize. And that means it's something big, something metapolitical is imminent. So, populism is over. It's dead. And something new, something more revolutionary, something more radical, something more nationalistic, organic, of the people, that's next. Stay tuned for more, and we'll talk soon.